A warm welcome to our final discussion of this long day. We discussed the title of the final panel, of today's final panel, and we were thinking about talking about the relevance of Frederick Kiesler today. My name is Stephan Hilpold. I'm responsible for the cultural section of the Viennese daily derStandard. As far as I know all the participants here on the panel, but may I introduce them very briefly. I will start with Barbara Imhof. She just had a lecture before. She's co-founder and managing partner and co-owner of LIQUIFER, a Viennese new space company. On her right side is Alison Clarke. She's chair of design history and theory of the University of Applied Arts. On the far left, we have Gert. He's the director, as you all know, of the Frederick Kiesler Private Foundation in Vienna. Next to him, we have Joachim Krausse. He's a retired professor of design theory at Anhalt University of Applied Science in Dessau. And Wolfgang Fiel, he is the co-organizer together with Mr. Zillner of this symposium, of this day, and he's a lecturer at the University of Applied Arts. So I would like to start with one of the main questions today. As you all know, Frederick Kiesler is a very radical thinker. At the same time, today's design and architecture is quite pragmatic. So my question would be, why is that so? Why is the utopian relevance of why is the utopian dimension of building and designing not as radical as it used to be, or as Kiesler imagined? Maybe I would like to start with Mr. Zillner as the director of the foundation. Why is that so? What do you think?
So why is today's building not that radical as it was in the
Why is it so difficult to be radical to as Kiesler imagined design and architecture could be?
I think you perhaps the main enemy of a radical alternative is in fact pragmatism and the economization of the building industry. And the more it is interesting to look at those historic alternatives to this kind of pragmatism. And perhaps it's either on the margins of today's building or with those very prestigious commissions where this pragmatism could be broken up. But if you look at some of the issues that were burning, are still burning for our society, affordable housing, social housing, I think in those cases, really the economization and the pragmatism,
But where do you see the utopian dimension of Kiesler for today's society? Where, at which point we should or could look closer at his work?
I think it is his completely interdisciplinary cross-trans or interdisciplinary approach to the various fields of arts, not only for architecture or design. I think all these boundaries, all these categories they didn't exist for him. So I think that is one of the most utopian things that makes him still interesting, and is a role model or key figure for today's creative practice.
Transdisciplinarity, I think that's one of the key words of Kiesler. Alison, Clarke, may I ask you from maybe more from the design perspective, what does that mean for in a practical sense as well, for in designing, in building?
Yeah, I'm not sure I can reflect on building so much. Definitely, I'm a design historian, and I think, okay, I've got a concern about transdisciplinarity and how it's used. I mentioned earlier about how it's applied as an ahistorical term. And I think during Kiesler's time, and indeed during Papanak's time, who I talked about earlier, transdisciplinarity was not about a holistic approach to design. On the contrary, particularly for Papanak, it was a blueprint in which experts from all fields were included. So if you were designing a space or a building for children with special needs, you included clinicians. You didn't make designers into pseudo-clinicians. And I think one really worrying thing about the move towards artistic practice, transdisciplinarity, social design that's happening, particularly across Europe, is a lot of it's very acritical in its practice. It's often, there's not much critique about what its role is, like why is that happening within our art schools, because a lot of that practice fits with a neoliberal economic model, in which we no longer genuinely politically, socially engage audiences. What we do is we get transdisciplinary teams to tick boxes for them. And so I think when you talk about utopianism, I think there was a utopianism in the 60s and 70s, and that was about incorporating actual people, indigenous groups and communities. And one concern I have about a certain type of transdisciplinarity and artistic research is it is only preaching to its own audience. It's very hermetically sealed, and I think that's also been a criticism of kind of art engagement and art practice. So I think we need to be very careful about what we mean by transdisciplinary activity.
Well, you're talking about a certain fragmentation of our world. How can we, leave that behind to a certain extent? What do we have to do, to bring all these subjects more together to get the connections?
Well, I think there's been a worrying move towards de-experting. It's become, certainly within neoliberal politics, the idea of experts as being redundant. And I think there's something really valuable about people being specialists. And that doesn't mean that designers only do one thing, but we can't pretend a designer's an anthropologist. And that's what's happened within corporate culture. Certainly, the rise of design anthropology, where it's just easier to make money because you can actually just apply bogus social science techniques. So there are ways of bringing people together, absolutely, but I think we have to understand how it fits into new economic models. I think we need to be more critical. That's all I'm asking for. We need to understand the historical moment in which we are talking about transdisciplinary activity. You can't just put scientists and artists together and create something wonderful.
Barbara Imhof, you were talking about your work, your experiences before. How could this work together? You have to do that in your work. How can that work? What are your experiences in that?
Well, I think there has to be a sort of a goal, a sort of mission objective in that sense, which needs to be sort of written together or defined together. And it's true, you can't just put, all kinds of disciplines, in one room and then, say, now work together. And it's very hard because it's really about language. Everybody speaks a different language and has a different terminology. And so to create. We always underestimate how long it takes to create a team which can work together. And normally I would always in these very transdisciplinary project, I always calculate like half a year with a lot of effort of also doing other things like having dinner together, or going bowling or whatever together. So to really make an effort to get to know each other and to create a language, and to also create space for discussions about. I always remember these discussions. What is life, or what is if you work with biologists, and very basic things, because even you have to understand that even the biologists among themselves, they don't have one opinion. And so for each project there has to be this kind of sort of creating a language or trying to understand each other. And then another point would be the familiarization with the other discipline. In terms of, one could go to the artist studio all together and do something there, create something there together, or go to the lab and do experiments there together, scientific lab, or any immersive thing like that. That also helps to create a truly collaborative environment.
Joachim, Krausse, you were nodding when Barbara Imhof was speaking. From your perspective, interdisciplinarity, transdisciplinarity, why is that so hard to achieve?
Yeah. Is it? Okay. So I agree completely with your observation of the difficulties of finding a language, finding a proper language for the common problem to be solved. And I see these pioneers, not so much utopian. I would not like to speak about utopianism in that context, but I see those figures like Kiesler and Fuller and also Grunewald. They are pioneers of seeing problems that the others don't see, and their very valuable contribution is to find words for that. Very often neologisms, or sometimes, like in the case of Fuller, writes about putting the house in order. And there he introduces the term ecology. Ecology. Nobody has used this word in such a context. Even in biology, it was not very popular. It just begins in the 1930s that ecology becomes a more or less important department of biology. But nobody uses it in relation to human beings and the relation of human beings to their environment. So we have the same with the term environment, the surrounding. It was not had not a specific meaning, but by those guys, it became a word with a specific meaning. So, or correlation, and so on, or regeneration, even regeneration. They work on problems to come. And I remember that situation at the end of the 1960s when I began to translate texts of Buckminster Fuller. into German, and I didn't understand that, and I had no models for the translation, you know. So it was really very hard to put that into a good German. We all had no consciousness of ecology at that time, and the environment, the environment movement in the 1960s were a movement of artists in the early 60s, and they knew of Fuller, of Kiesler, and so on. So the environmentalism in the arts was the first ecological movement, I would say, and only then it became a political one. You know. So in order to understand the situation today, we have to pick up these concepts. I mean, it is not the question of form, not at all. It is the question of concepts and understanding these concepts. In the last years, I had a project, an exhibition project, Licht, Luft, Scheiße. This was centered around Leberecht Migge and his work in gardening. You know. And I contributed to this group with clarifying some of the ecological terms, because they come from very, very different sources, so that our task is to unify it and to make it clear what the specific meaning is with those terms like biosphere, for instance, the biosphere. Yeah, oh, okay. This is, and it comes from geology. It comes from not only from biology, but it comes from systems theory and so on. Nobody has done this work in the academic world. There is no department for a proper language of what we need as tools of a good understanding, you know. So we are all, in a way, archaeologists of concepts, more or less, and that work has to be done. And my contribution was 5 terms, not more, you know. But we need that.
Alison, Clarke, you wanted to add something?
Concepts we're discussing, which is a bit boring. Sorry about that. I missed a trendy story. We're talking about Buckminster Fuller. Nobody in the whole of this symposium has mentioned where the funding for most of Fuller's experiments and transdisciplinary activities came from, and that was from the US government and in the military. And the 20th century, the transdisciplinarity that we're referring to, was bankrolled by the US Army and by Cold War experimentation. Many of the film experiments, many of the visual experiments, the money came either explicitly or covertly from the US military. The same with transdisciplinary experiments. Buckminster Fuller and Victor Papanak were invited around the Nordic regions and Aspen Design Conference. They spoke together. Both of them talked about ecology, environment, radical design solutions. Both of them were paid by the US military to calm down, indirectly or directly. Definitely Buckminster Fuller very directly. He didn't hide his military interventions in Afghanistan or in the Nordic regions. And so that transdisciplinary experiment, that's what I'm trying to point out. It doesn't come from anywhere. It's bankrolled. It comes from a particular set of politics. And I think we're naive if we just talk about it as a creative process. Because some of the people that we refer to, you know, they're embedded in those histories. And we need to complexify them and their contradictions.
But especially today, I mean, all the concepts you were talking about, I mean, they are key. They are so important. There is quite a lot of money outside. So Wolfgang Fiel, why is that so difficult to, if I understand you, if you understood you in the correct way, to get also that money for concepts like this, for projects like this?
I'm not sure whether it's difficult, probably not. Probably exactly the opposite, depending on where you come from and who is backing you, or what the agenda is. I would like to nevertheless though comment on the notion of interdisciplinarity, because it pertains partly to my own definition of my own work. I totally agree that we have to be very critical about that. There's no doubt about that. But if we come to define interdisciplinarity as something that is actually trying to connect the dots, to see the links and the relations between various fields of expertise, I'm more positive about the idea that there are people out there who have the kind of sensitivity and sensibility to do exactly that. And for me, actually, Fuller and Kiesler and also Papanek are exemplary versions of those kinds of sensibilities who have been able, to connect the dots, to see the links between certain problems and certain issues that we are dealing with, usually in compartments of specialized people working on a very peculiar and specific topic. So I think interdisciplinary is not about people knowing everything about all the disciplines, but who are able to connect the dots and see the links, and to initiate a meaningful conversation and to agree on a handful of terms at least, and to kind of find that language we have been talking about, that we can commonly kind of exchange these sorts of ideas. So I'm much more positive in terms of the kinds of agency of interdisciplinarity as the kind of linking of the dots ability. And I think about the notion of utopianism. For me, all three of them are utopian thinkers, but not that's discredited too easily. Being a utopian is not being a dreamer, as usually the kind of association may go along with them, especially in the kind of sort of economic circumstances. For me, that's a quality that pertains to something that lies in the future, which may or may not come true, or may not fulfill itself. But it's again the kind of sensibility to foresee, as Mr. Krausse said, some of the problems which will come and we will have to deal with. And especially Fuller is a really beautiful example of many of the themes that he was already talking about, which are now coming back to haunt us. So he foresaw a lot of these problems. Back in the days, he was the utopian dreamer. Why is it necessary to preserve the environment, to think about the planet, in that way. And that totally ties in with the notion of holistic thinking. Connecting the dots again, looking into the future, and initiate a conversation between experts. Certainly we still need them, but we need people as well mediating in between these types of specialized fields of knowledges. And I totally insist that both qualities are really necessary, independent of where the money comes from, by the way.
You were speaking about this difficulties of finding a common language and the need of also translating. When I read the manifesto of the Correalities, sorry, difficult word. I had some difficulties. I have to admit. Mr. Zunner, I mean, as the director also of the Kiesler Foundation, how much work of translation do you need to also communicate the work of these pioneers to today's audience?
In fact, that's the key question. I think it's the key question for all those monographic institutions that are administrating estates of outstanding personalities. So, of course, there's always this very special interest of a scientific community, which mustn't be furthered. So it exists for itself, and then they find you as the institution that is administrating the estate. And then, so as we are also celebrating our 25th jubilee of the founding of the establishing of the foundation, we recognized certain roles. In the beginning, it was mainly an interest in formal aspects of Kiesler's work. For example, the endless house, the biomorphic, his biomorphic design, and this completely shifted to to structural aspects of his work, which is of interest today. But this makes it much more difficult to mediate. Because if you have a spectacular building or spectacular model, then that's easy. So it's just, you send photographs of his models of the endless house, which have which have a fantastic aesthetic quality. But what with, and I think as the director of the foundation, I may say, what with very edgy and not easy to define concepts or theories, like the Correalities theory. That makes it much more difficult. But as we are also a research center, so I have quite I see how many inquiries come, and I think every second is about the Correalities. I think it's perhaps it's because after the putting sustainable design in the center, people are now looking for something else, and then they are accessing perhaps ideas or concepts that they haven't completely thought through or haven't completely understood, but they still could project their own ideas or their own visions onto it. And but of course that makes it attractive to have a figure that is so far ahead of his time that his concepts are now in a certain center of interest.
Yeah, I would like to comment on the one sort of idea of how you can sell these people today to today's audiences or students or whoever is interested in them potentially. I would actually make the opposite claim, Gert, if you may allow me to say that. I believe actually, and that's my own observation also with my students, that the endless house stood in the way of actually getting to know who Kiesler really is, you know. So it's this one icon that usually architects, especially architects, are really so obsessed and focused upon that it really blocks out anything else that Kiesler stands for, especially theory of correalism. So I believe, I'm super happy actually that's done and dusted with, you know, which is not to say it's beautiful and great and has its own quality, will always have that. But I think now opening the door towards a deeper understanding of the systemic qualities that the kind of theories of Kiesler bring to the table actually opens the possibility to access totally new audiences. So I believe for Kiesler it's very good news that the form idea is dissolving finally.
Well, I think that probably we have also a different understanding of form or of this whole of architecture. I'd like to say two things. There was, at the beginning you were asking for, you know, where's the radical architecture or where is it today? And I think there are a lot of concepts, but they're in a different scale, and you have to look for them. Maybe somewhere else, not, you know, in that kind of iconic manifestation of a building. It still does exist, but I think it's more in sort of either you find it in these transdisciplinary research projects where you know, a lot of, because architecture or the architecture profession has sort of there's still the traditional way, but then you know, the way architects work today are also a lot in different fields. And I don't mean that they try to be experts in other fields, but I mean that with the traits they learn during their studies of integration of different elements of systems or the way they think, that they can, you know, be useful in other fields as well. So, you know, we can't look, you know, when we when we look for any kind of radical statements, manifestations from architects, we cannot only look at a building, you know, because it's not the only work which is produced. And then the second thing, I think I forgot, but it's probably also in that more. Oh yeah, that's that. So 100 years ago, 1920s. So it's approximately 100 years ago. I think that was sort of really where a lot of new concepts were developed. The technology was sort of, the industrial era was sort of, getting another peak, and also this whole environmental topic was sort of maybe becoming more popular, and then it got forgotten again. But I think why we can relate to Kiesler again and to not only his endless house but also the theories behind is because we're, we can, how can I say, we're at a similar point in time. And I think that is probably the interesting part. So can we learn something, or what is it what we can take further?
Mr. Krause, you have so much experience with these pioneers, as you called them before, with Mr. Kiesler, Mr. Fuller-Papanek. Is it becoming easier to talk about them, to explain them to today's audience because of the problems we are aware of and the concepts they had in their time? Or is it still really difficult? I mean, we were talking about especially the language we have to find. What is your perspective on that?
I think the conventional understanding of architecture is not sufficient for the real role that architecture plays in society. Society expects of architecture that the architects know best the field of structure. The field of structure. You have a lot of architects and designers who have today the function of integrating the process, the group, or are managers, successful managers, or in the sciences to bring people together, like Herbert Simon. He's an architect. There is a capacity, and the architects, I mean, the profession, rejects that understanding of architecture. The prototypical Philip Johnson rejecting Buckminster Fuller is no architect. Oh, no, never. So that closes the door to a deeper understanding of structure. And on the other hand, people like Buckminster Fuller, he helped to clarify in 2 cases of Nobel Prizes some fundamental problems the experts were unable to solve. So, even there, we have the need of a different understanding that is not only based on specialist knowledge and so on, and to find means of communication, terms, and so on. And therefore, this chapter of an ongoing avant-garde in the arts and in architecture especially is indispensable. So they couldn't find funds for funding the laboratory, and therefore the military was the only to give a little bit, yeah, the concepts are earlier, you know. If you study shelter, then who was from the industrial world or the military to fund those people? They didn't. Only when they needed them, then came a little bit. It's a small portion, you know. Then the funds came only from the military. When it turned out to be useful to build a geodesic for the radar system, you know.
I'd just like to say I find problematic running probably through the Symposium idea of three great white males, that there's some kind of amazing creative genius in their transdisciplinarity that stands completely separate from the entire political and social structure that surrounds them. And my question would be, to your previous question, why should we ask? There are very few students in this room. It hasn't been fully attended by students, which I think is a real shame in the centre of Vienna's University of Applied Arts. And we need to be asking ourselves as historians, academics, people in educators, why should we expect students in art and design, architecture, cross-disciplinary, to be interested in rehashing ideas of dead white 20th century men? There's a completely obvious question that has not been raised here, and it's not because, I'm a historian, I've written a book about Papineau. It's not because I don't think it's relevant, but I don't think just rehashing it, repackaging it, taught in this very hagiographical, hero-worshipping way is the way forward. There are many contemporary ideas. These kind of figures completely squash and quash lots of other figures and make them invisible. And I direct the Papineau Foundation, but I do not advocate his ideas. It's a platform. The people, the new students that read his books or discover his work by accident or design, they're the creative people. They're the ones that decide what the meaning is, not anyone involved in the foundation.
But why is that so? Why is it so difficult to raise interest among today's students for figures like Kiesler, Papineau, what do you think?
Papineau isn't the problem, but not the man. The ideas and the fact that the book designed for the real world still hold precedence, just like I'm sure Kiesler's and Fuller's work does. But I think we have to let it run its own new contemporary course. We can't keep using these same models. I mean, I think it is problematic to just have this triangulation of great white men and not really problematize that. In the presentations we've had today, there are so many absences. There are absences of the students that worked on these projects, invisible labour of indigenous cultures, invisible labour of many of the women that keep the archives, that were involved in lots of this creativity. And I think that's a really important point to make. And if you want to get a new generation of students, they're fully aware of the politics around creativity. Perhaps we're not reflecting it.
Well, maybe let's ask this question also to the two guys who organized this edition.
Well, I'm fully aware of exactly this problem, which is probably why I keep on coming back to the question, is Kiesler still relevant? I mean, to stick with Kiesler for the time being, at least from my point of view. And the way I lead with this is, first of all, actually my students now educate me on all these issues you're talking about. So I'm the white old man in the room myself, actually, these days. So I think I'm perfectly clear in that sense where I stand personally. And secondly, and that comes on top of that, my students are also clever enough to pick what they believe is relevant for their current point of view. And that's why I keep on telling them the story about also old white men, because they may find some spark or some kind of element of inspiration, despite them being dead, being male, and being funded by the military complex or whatever it was. I think it's really up to them to decide what it is to be picked up. And I fully trust my students, and this is really my personal experience, that they are capable of doing that. It's not my point to educate them exactly on that anymore, because they do educate me. That's really my experience. And I find it really sad also, I can say, that there are not more of them here today. But that only tells me there's more work to be done, you know? Not only on Kiesler, on many others as well. But I think it's really, I think that there's some elements which are still relevant, and I don't see any mistake in picking them up and reinterpreting them from the contemporary point of view. I'm not saying copy or uncritically just picking it up or affirmatively just doing what they did. Totally not. That's not the idea.
So maybe let's do that with another Kiesler concept, with another very important key to his work. He was very into artistic research, a word which became so popular in the last years. As you wrote in your abstract, he was a kind of a trailblazer for it. Maybe from your perspective, is his approach to artistic what does his approach to artistic research tell us today? To which extent is it still relevant, or is it similar to our approach to artistic research we have in universities or in artistic work? What do you think about that?
I think it's very complicated. If we use the terminology that we have today to describe today's issues and put them back in a situation of the 1940s. I think for Kiesler, it just developed. So he had he had something that was, I think, quite common in Vienna in the early 20th century, a fundamental critique on functionalism. And out of this, he created a way to just shift around the whole complex of this functionalism, which he called pseudo-functionalism. And therefore, he said, well, it's not the issue of a designer to design a new object. It's, you have to, he labeled it very popular, rewriting this called formula, form follows function. So he said, well, form does not follow function, something that is typical for Kiesler, starting with a negation. Form does not follow function. And then he says, form follows vision, and vision follows reality. And as one of his key qualities was visualizing his theory, visualizing it with charts, he drew he drew a very popular chart where he said, well, you have to start with the existing facts, the world as it exists. You have to look for your daily life, the objects that further your daily living. And then you have to look for new objectives, not for new objects. And those objectives, they could lead to new objects, but must not. And when a new object is created, of course it gets again part of the existing facts of the world that we are living in. It is tested and once again becomes part of this never-ending, endless circle. So of this open design process. But I think it was not. Of course, he was. He was convinced that architecture should also apply certain qualities of science. But I think it would be. It's a little bit tricky to apply the term artistic research to what he did, because I think it didn't exist at the time.
Well, you did that in your abstract, sorry. So maybe I would like to ask Alison Clarke about sorry for it.
I'm sure I haven't spoken enough. I totally agree with Gert. I don't think you can compare them. I mean, at every period, and also I think the idea that transdisciplinarity is recent. I mean, I don't remember in my lifetime not studying anything in design that wasn't transdisciplinary. It's just different conglomerations of different disciplines, be you studying history or design or whatever. I think probably it's just become politically more expedient to describe transdisciplinarity. It's in other words, it's become much more institutionalized. Art practice has got its own history. I'm not sure. I agree. I wouldn't describe actually what Kiesler did. I'm not a Kiesler expert. From what I know, certainly wouldn't describe it as artistic practice, because I think there are so many other elements and the political context of those experiments. One thing I would say is the kind of obsession with manifestos. And when you said you had some difficulty kind of interpreting it, I'm not entirely sure manifestos are always supposed to be transparent. I think we need to acknowledge that these figures were in the process of creating cultural capital around themselves, and one of the key ways of doing that was creating manifestos. And talking about Fuller, Kiesler in particular, they were very self-documenting, and they were selling that as much as anything else. Not objects, buildings as such, but their manifestos and their writings.
We were looking for, the points of Kiesler which are of some relevance for our lives or for the artistic work of today. Well, let me ask from another question, in which points Frederick Kiesler failed, to which extent was he wrong, where do his thoughts or ideas or his work lead from our perspective, in a wrong direction?
That's a tricky one. He was certainly wrong in more than one ways, as anyone is somehow. It's really, that one is a tricky one, because it's really hard to contextualize him in the time that he did really develop these kind of theories. So looking back, of course, bears the kind of risk that we blend out certain aspects where he was probably wrong in the context of the time that he was operating in. But I think to a certain extent, I would say at least the following. I believe that the kind of idea that there's the kind of single sort of visionary creator or the genius that creates ex nihilo, like we believe to be doing that as artistic creators, is certainly something that Kiesler was still kind of adhering to. And I believe what we are seeing now over the last sort of 10-15 years, certainly now in a contemporary context, is this idea that collective creation is getting much more traction, is getting much more importance. And certainly people start to understand that the kind of single vision of a single person is not enough anymore to stem all the problems that we are having to deal with. So my main criticism about all these people is not that they are male or white, is rather like that they happen to be these kind of, islands, if I may call it like that, And we heard it actually in many lectures today. They had a lot of influences, of course, from other people. They sustained a lot of dialogues with all kinds of experts and all kinds of people, but yet we keep on looking at them as these kind of single heroes, these kind of lone heroes, which they haven't been anyways in the first case. And currently from today's perspective, it's becoming really clear that that's going to be a model that ends, or has ended already actually, to a certain extent.
Imhof, you were taking the microphone?
Yes. I think that, I'd like to respond to both of you, because you were saying before, you were claiming, okay, there are these, these white men, and everybody forgets, what is behind, and it's without context. And I think it's really, we just have to create a new narrative. And I think that is, and we have to do that probably with a lot of things, also to give ourselves an opportunity to find new perspectives. And I also think that, there's nothing, we can't, I would say we can't say that anything is wrong or with Kiesler's theory, because he didn't have the opportunity to test it. When can you say that something failed or is wrong if you have tested it and you find out, okay, this doesn't work out. But, it was sort of, he was in a community and they were all thinking together with lots of different people, and then everybody wrote a piece. And then, but we could, the way you described it with these three people, and, it already became clear that it was a whole setting, and probably there were many more people, and if we could sort of make that more public or present or show it, display it, then suddenly we also would get new perspective and probably new insights.
Who wants to add something? Mr. Krausse?
To say in addition, in this situation, it is really helpful to have the archive, to use the archive in that sense to clarify or to correct the picture. Those people who staged themselves, we have to correct them, and the archive is to be activated for not only scholars but students. I had seen the project of Arnold Reiblatt, who activated in that sense the archive of Black Mountain College, and this is now also very interesting. It's now the task of artists to do that, and in that sense we have to correct the picture. That's no question, and we see in behind a very rich scenery of discussion, exchange, and society. Through the individuals, we see patterns in the society. But I think for artistic research, it is now the good situation that we have some examples of open archives and the possibility to go to those sources that are there. And therefore, I'm really happy that the Kiesler Archive plays such an active role here in Vienna. This is really a good model. Okay, thank you again.
I had the idea of doing one last round, but your words, they're like a very beautiful end to this discussion. But before we close this discussion, let me ask the audience if there are any questions or any remarks, any ideas you would like to add.
I would like to share some thoughts. Is that fine without a mic? Or?
No, please have a mic.
I'm always fascinated by the complexities that arise in frame and reframe either knowledge through different disciplines or different gazes. And this principle I hear to look at will through the gaze of somebody else is, I think, for me always a meta narrative to achieve, to say, okay, whoever or whatever, there is this training, this constant training to take the perspective from another viewpoint. And I find it interesting if we go to this question, why do we have these three proponents here without having, for example, a female antagonist? I was thinking of this theatrical practice of interpreting, for example, Shakespeare. So we have Shakespeare as a maybe woman. It's not so clear if Shakespeare is a man or a woman, but let's say he's a man. And then we have translations from different translators, from Schiller to Brasch. And then we have quite interesting female directors that interpret Shakespeare. So we have Karin Sander, Andrea Breth, also Florentina Holzinger was somehow approaching things. And then we have this kind of appropriation. And so I was very curious to also, and grateful to hear that there are new models possible also in the archiving and leading a foundation that enable new views and appropriation that somehow bring the knowledge to a present, but also in a critical manner, and rethink processes of authorship and bring this at stake. So to me, this, I don't know if I should call it a transdisciplinary dialogue, at least it's a dialogue. Yeah, it's always a challenge, but thank you for bringing this in. Yeah, that's more something like a comment, I guess.
Thank you for your remarks. Well, it's not up to me to close this discussion. I think it's up to both of you to close this discussion and this day, so please go ahead.
So, well, I think we really enjoyed a lot of inspiring talks, and at least I learned a lot today, which is always great. Well, of course, to be continued, I think. So, you know, with Kiesler, it's always hard to come to an end, because everything is endless. But now it comes to language.
But not infinite.
That's what I'm saying. It's not infinite, it's endless. So all ends meet. So thank you very much for your contributions. Thank you very much for your patience and your endurance. And as to be continued, we are celebrating 25 years now. At least 25 more.